Fratres, Anno VV, Sol 20 degrees Leo, Luna 0 degrees Aquarius, Dies Martes, the decan of Mars in Leo, August 13th, 2019, Vilga, 9:32 a.m., hour of Mercury. Do what thy wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will. For I am divided for love's sake, for the chance of union. Liber al vel leges. I 29. The Rosicrucians, their rites and mysteries. With chapters on the ancient rite, on the ancient fire and serpent worshippers, and explanations of the mystic symbols represented in the monuments and talismans of the primeval philosophers. Second edition, revised, corrected, and considerably enlarged by Hargrave Jennings, author of The Indian Religions, or Results of the Mysterious Buddhism, Curious Things of the Outside World, Live Lights are Dead Lights, Altar are Talbe, One of the 30, The Obelisk, Its Origin, History, and Purpose. Written originally at the time of this recording, 1879. Illustrated by upwards of 300 engravings. London, Chatto and Windus, Piccadilly. This work is in the public domain. First published London, John Houghton, 1870. Second edition London, Chatto and Windus, 1879. This electric text issued by Caiaphas Press, Leeds, 2003. Unto the very points and pricks, here are to be found great mysteries. Nicolas Flamel, 1399. Which is the why the brothers pass their time in the lodge singing Balkan hymns or TIMORLANE? Why we of disparate matter call each other brethren? Why the lodestone cross, the Damascan steel compass became glass encased? Why an emerald-headed meme rules the world? Gassendus, 1630, translated by Fratres. Dedication in the first edition, 1870, to John Camden Houghton. As a mark of respect, I dedicate this book. Hargrave Jennings. Symbol of the AA. It is somewhat unusual, I believe, for an author to dedicate a book to his publisher, but the unfledgling industry of Mr. Houghton, in his double capacity of author and bookseller, has always surprised me. And as some testimony to this activity, and to the fact that he has found or made time to write, or edit some 20 different works. Some 20 different works, I have, without asking his permission, much pleasure in penning the above. London, January 1st, 1870. The preface to the present edition is foregone. Preface to the first edition. This book, which now leaves our hands, concentrates in a small compass the results of very considerable labor and the diligent study of very many books and languages, living and dead. It purports to be a history, for the first time treated seriously in English, of the famous order of the Rose Cross, or of the Rosicrucians. No student of the occult philosophy need, however, fear that we shall not most carefully keep guard, standing sentry, so to speak, not only over this which is by far the preeminent, but also over those other recondite systems which are connected with the illustrious Rosicrucians. An accomplished author of our own period has remarked that he who deals in the secrets of magic, or in the secrets of the human mind, is too often looked upon with jealous eyes by the world, which is no great conjurer. How is it that after centuries of doubt or denial, how happens it in face of the reason that can make nothing of it, the common sense that rejects, and the science which can demonstrate it as impossible, the supernatural still has such vital hold in the human, not to say the modern mind? How happens it that the most terrible fear is the fear of the invisible? This too, when we are on all hands assured that the visible alone is that which we have to dread. The ordinary reason exhorts us to dismiss our fears. That thing, magic, that superstition, miracle, is now banished wholly from the beliefs of this clear-seeing, educated age. Miracle, we are told, never had a place in the world, only in men's delusions. It is nothing more than a fancy. It never was anything more than a superstition arising from ignorance. What is fear? It is a shrinking from possible harm, either to the body or to the thing which we dominate the mind that is in us. The body shrinks with instinctive nervous alarm, like the sensitive leaf when its easy, comfortable exercise or sensations are disturbed. Our book, inasmuch as it deals, or professes to deal, seriously with strange things and with deep mysteries, needs the means of interpretation in the full attention of the reader. Otherwise, little will be made, or can come of it. It is, in brief, a history of the alchemical philosophers, written with a serious explanatory purpose, and for the first time impartially stated since the days of James I and Charles I. This is really what the book pretends to be, and nothing more. It should be mentioned that the peculiar views and deductions to be found herein were hinted at as demonstrable for the first time by the same author in the year 1858, when a work entitled Curious Things of the Outside World was produced. Let it be understood, however, that the author distinctly excepts against being in any manner identified with all the opinions, religious or otherwise, which are to be found in this book. Some of them are indeed most extraordinary, but in order to do full justice to the speculations of the Hermetic brethren, he has put forward their ideas with as much of their original force as he was able, and in some parts of this book he believes he has urged them with such apparent warmth that they will very likely seem to have been his own most urgent convictions. As far as he can succeed in being so considered, the author wishes to be regarded simply as the historian of the Rosicrucians, or as an essayist on their strange, mysterious beliefs. Whether he will succeed in engaging the attention of modern readers to a consideration of this time-honored philosophy remains to be seen. But this he is assured of, that the admiration of all students and reflective minds will be excited by the unrivaled powers of thinking of the Rosicrucians. The application proper or otherwise of these powers is a matter altogether beside the present inquiry. The author has chiefly chosen for exposition the Latin writings of the great English Rosicrucian Robert Flood, or Flood, Robertus de Fluctibus, who lived in the times of James I and Charles I. Our final remarks shall be those of a very famous brother of the RC, writing under the date of 1653. I will now close up, saith he, with the doxology of a most excellent, renowned Philocryphus. Soli Dio laus et potentia, amen in mercurio, qua pedibus licit cadens decurit aqua, et metallis universalitur operatur. London, January 20th, 1870. Autoria Rosicruci, Rites and Mysteries. Contents. Chapter the First. Critics of the Rosicrucians criticized. Chapter the Second. Singular Adventure in Staffordshire. Chapter the Third. Insufficiency of Worldly Objects. Chapter the Fourth. The Hermetic Philosophers. Chapter the Fifth. An Historical Adventure. Chapter the Sixth. The Hermetic Brethren. Chapter the Seventh. Mythic History of the Fleur-de-Lis. Chapter the Eighth. Sacred Fire. Chapter the Ninth. Fire Theosophy of the Persians. Chapter the 10th. Ideas of the Rosicrucians as to the character of fire. Chapter the 11th. Monuments raised to fire worship in all countries. Chapter the 12th. Juridical stones and their worship. Chapter the 13th. Inquiry as to the possibility of miracle. Chapter the 14th. Can evidence be depended upon? Examination of Hume's reasoning. Chapter the 15th. Footsteps of the Rosicrucians amidst architectural objects. Chapter the 16th. The Round Towers of Ireland. Chapter the 17th, Prismatic Investiture of the Microcosm. Chapter the 18th, Kabbalistic Interpretations by the Gnostics. Chapter the 19th, Mystic Christian Figures and Talismans. Chapter the 20th, the Rosy Cross in Indian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and medieval monuments. Chapter the 21st, Myth of the Scorpion, or the Snake, in its many disguises. Chapter the 22nd, Ominous Character of the Color White to English Royalty. Chapter the 23rd, The Beliefs of the Rosicrucians, Meaning of Lights and of Commemorative Flambeaux in All Worship. Chapter the 24th, The Great Pyramid. Chapter the 25th, History of the Tower of Steeple. History of the Tower or Steeple. Chapter the 26th, Presence of the Rosicrucians in Heathen and Christian Architecture. Chapter the 27th, The Rosicrucians amidst Ancient Mysteries and in the Orders of Knighthood. Chapter the 28th, Rosicrucianism in Strange Symbols. Chapter the 29th, Connection between the Templars and Gnosticism. Chapter the 30th, Rosicrucian Origin of the Order of the Garter. Chapter the 31st, Rosicrucian Supposed Means of Magic through Signs, Sigils, and Figures. Chapter the 32nd, Astro-Theosophical System of the Rosicrucians, the Alchemic Magisterium. Chapter the 33rd, Rosicrucian Celestial and Terrestrial, Means of Intercommunication. Chapter the 34th, The Pre-Adamites, Profound Kabbalistic or Rosicrucian Speculation. Chapter the 35th, The Adapted Rosicrucian Contemplation, Intrusion of Sin, Ruins of the Old Worlds. Chapter the 36th, Indian Mysterious Adoration of Forms, the unity of the mythologies found in the Buddhistic and Mohammedan temples. Chapter the 37th, Doctrine and Rationale, the embodied children of the elements, both of heathen and of Christian periods. Chapter the 38th, Robert Flood, Robertus de Fluctibus, the English Rosicrucian. Supplementary notes. The first, Notice of an Ancient Work, 1595. The second, Rosicrucian Views on the Ark of Noah. The third, Kabbalistic Illustrations, the Saint Real or Holy Real or Grail. Concluding note, remarks upon two curious works. The Rosicrucians. Pictured is a version of the hieroglyphic monad as crucifix or swastika with the title Badge of the Grand Master of the Templars. Chapter the first. Critics of the Rosicrucians. Criticized. That modern science, spite of its assumptions and of its intolerant dogmatism, is much at fault, nay, to a great extent a very vain thing, is a conclusion that often presents itself to the minds of thinking persons. Thus, thoughtful people who choose to separate themselves from the crowd, and who do not altogether give in with such edifying submission to the indoctrination of the scientific classes, notwithstanding that these latter have the support generally of that which by a wide term is called the press in this country, quietly decline reliance on modern science. They see that there are numerous shortcomings of teachers in medicine, which fails frequently, though always with its answer, in theology, which chooses rather that men should sleep, though not the right sleep, than consider waking, nay, in all the branches of human knowledge. The fashion in regard to which is to disparage the ancient schools of thought by exposing what are called their errors by the light of modern assumed infallible discovery. It never once occurs to those eager, conceited professors that they themselves may possibly have learned wrongly, that the old knowledge they decry is underrated because they do not understand it, in that entirely because the light of the modern world is so brilliant in them, so dark to them, as eclipsed in this novel artificial light, is the older and better and truer sunshine nearer to the ancients, because time itself was newer to the old peoples of the world, and because the circumstances of the first making of time were more understood in the then first divine disclosing, granting that time ever had a beginning, as man's reason insists it must. Shelley, the poet, who, if he had not been so great as a metaphysician, that is, when age and experience had ripened and corrected his original brilliant crudities of thought, used to declare that most men, at least most thinking men, spend the latter half of their lives in unlearning the mistakes of the previous half. This he declares to have been the fact in his own experience, which was, even for this test, a very brief one, for Shelley was only 29 when his lamentable death occurred. The early departure of three brilliant poetic spirits of our father's period, at the time that it is very melancholy, is worthy of deep remark. Shelley was, as we have said, 29. Byron was only 36. John Keats, in some respects, the most poetically intense and abstract of the three, was only 24. And in these short several lifetimes, measuring so few years, these distinguished persons had achieved that which resulted in the enrollment of their names in a nation's catalogue, in a grand branch of human attainment. They live in lasting records, they grow in honor, and their names do not fade, as is the case with those reputations which have been unduly magnified, but which give way to time. Perhaps the lot of some contemporaneous accepted important, not to say great, reputations will be diminution and disappearance. Time is not only an avenger, but a very judicious corrector. We are so concerned of the irresistible dominancy all the world over of opinions and of the dicta relative to this or that merit, or this or that truth, propounded by people with names and of influence in our good, readily believing England, and of the power of supposed authority in matters of taste and literary acceptance, that we desire to warn querists against the statements about the fraternity, for it is just not a body of the Rosicrucians appearing in all the published accounts, whether of this country or abroad. We have examined all the supposed notices and explanations of who the Rosicrucians were in biographical works, in encyclopedias and histories, and we find them all prejudiced and misrepresenting, really telling no truth, and only displaying a deplorable amount of mischievous ignorance. They are, besides, in the main copied from each other, which is notably the case with the early encyclopedias. Old Fuller, who has some notices of Robert Flood, a famous English member of the Order of the Rosicrucians, fully admits his ignorance of whom the brotherhood comprised, and of their constitution or purpose. All generally received accounts, therefore, are wrong, principally for three reasons. First, through ignorance. Secondly, through prejudice. Thirdly, as instigated by distrust, dislike, and envy. For in criticism, it is a dogma that the subject must be always under the critic, never that by a chance the subject may be above the critic, that is, above the critic's grasp and comprehension. But suppose the criticized choose to accept to the ability of the critic in any way to judge of him. From this obstinacy and conceit arise much underrating and false comment, as is implied in the following, which is extracted from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which account is copied again into several other encyclopedias and repeated into smaller works with even malicious fidelity. Quote, in fine, the Rosicrucians and all their fanatical descendants agree in proposing the most crude and incomprehensible notions and ideas in the most obscure, quaint, and unusual expressions. End quote. Encyclopedia Britannica, article Rosicrucians. During the age of James I, Charles I, even during the Protectorate, and again in the time of Charles II, the singular doctrines of the Rosicrucians attracted a large amount of attention and excited much keen controversy. Sundry replied or apologies appeared on the part of the Rosicrucians. Among them was a most able work published in Latin by Dr. Robert Flood at Leiden in 1616. It is a small, closely printed, very learned octavo, entitled Apologia Compendiara Fraternitatis de Rosicruce, etc. And abounds in knowledge. It is an exceedingly rare work, but there is a copy in the British Museum. All this long period was marked by considerable speculation regarding these Rosicrucians. Pope's Rape of the Lock is founded upon some of their fanciful Kabbalistic ideas. The Spectator contains notices of the Mystic Society, and to prove the public curiosity concerning the Rosicrucians, and a strange incident, the particulars of which we are going to supply from the best sources now for the first time, we may state that there is included in one number of Addison's elegant series of papers called The Spectator, a resumption of a notice, and some after comment upon the supposed discovery of a burial place in England of one of these mighty men, the Rosicrucians. The story is to the following purport, as nearly as it can be gathered. We have written much more fully of it from other means. The Spectator's account is very full of errors, and was evidently gained afar off. And merely from hearsay, as it were, it is besides poor and ineffective, gathered from no authority, and produced with no dramatic force. For the life and the beliefs of the Rosicrucians were very dramatic, at the same time that the latter were very true, although generally disbelieved. There is a mark of a Delphic E, which appears as a final moon, waning moon, or reversed C with a small indentation in the middle as an E. In the modern terms, it looks very much like a Star Wars Rebel Alliance symbol turned widdershins 90 degrees. For anyone listening, this is the end of chapter 1. Please forgive the reader, Frater Kenosis, mistakes. They are actually corrections of words that I may have misspoken, which is far more important than a singular monologue. So accept them as corrections and let that not be a hindrance to continuing. The next symbol is the crux ansata, which looks like a T form or Franciscan cross, T cross, with an O or even a mirror on top. There are two isosceles triangles meeting at their apex tips, and beneath them is a long bar, a rectangle extending downward. Most people would say it appears to be an ankh, but an ankh is a continuous symbol, and the O is clearly above this T mark, which is all attached to itself. There are 10 angles in the T, known in the circle. The most important and persistent figure in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Chapter the 2nd. Singular Adventure in Staffordshire. Dr. Plott, who was a very well-known and reliable man and a painstaking antiquary and writer of natural history, in his History of Staffordshire, published by him in the time of Charles II, relates the following strange story: that a countryman was employed at the close of a certain dull summer's day. Interestingly, at the reading of this text, save maybe 1 or 2 months, the Queen of England, Elizabeth I of England, Wales, and Scotland, and all of Great Britain, named her son Charles, Prince of Wales, to be her successor. We assume he will be called Charles IV, unless he takes the name King Arthur. that a countryman was employed at the close of a certain dull summer's day in digging a trench in a field in a valley, round which the country rose into sombre, silent woods, vocal only with the quaint cries of the infrequent magpies. It was some little time after the sun had sunk, and the countryman was just about giving over his labor for the day. Dr. Plott say that, in one or two of the last languid strokes of his pick, the rustic came upon something stony and hard, which struck a spark, clearly visible in the increasing gloom. At this surprise he resumed his labor, and, curiously enough, found a large flat stone in the center of his field. This field was far away from any of the farms or cotes, as they were called in those days, with which the now almost twilight country was sparingly dotted. In a short time he cleared the stone free of the grass and weeds which had grown over it, and it proved to be a large oblong slab, with an immense iron ring fixed at one end in a socket. For half an hour the countryman essays to stir this stone in vain. At last he bethought himself of some yards of rope which he had lying near amongst his tools, and these he converted, being an ingenious, inquisitive, inventive man, into a tackle, by means of which, and by passing the sling round a bent tree, in line with the axis of the stone, he contrived in the last of the light, and with much expenditure of toil, to raise it. And then, greatly to his surprise, he saw a large, deep, hollow place, buried in darkness, which, when his eyes grew accustomed a little to it, he discovered was the top story of a stone staircase, seemingly of extraordinary depth, for he saw nothing below. The country fellow had not the slightest idea of where this could lead to, but being a man, though a rustic and a clown of courage, and most probably urged by his idea that the staircase led to some secret repository where treasure lay buried, he descended the first few steps cautiously, and tried to peer in vain down into the darkness. This seemed impenetrable, but there was some object at a vast cold distance below. Looking up to the fresh air and seeing the star Venus, the evening star, shining suddenly like a planet in encouraging unexpected brilliancy, although the sky had still some beautiful placid sunlight in it. The puzzled man left the upper ground and descended silently a fair, though a somewhat broken staircase. Here, at an angle as near as he could judge of 100 feet underground, he came upon a square landing place with a niche in the wall, and then he saw a further long staircase descending at right angles to the first staircase, and still going down into deep cold darkness. The man cast a glance upward as if questioning the small amount of light from the upper world which shot down, whether he should continue his search or desist and return. All was stillest of the still about him, but he saw no reason particularly to fear. So, imagining that he would in some way soon penetrate the mystery, and feeling in the darkness by his hands upon the wall, and by his toes to make sure first ton each step, he resolutely descended, and he deliberately counted 220 steps. He felt no difficulty in his breathing, except a certain sort of aromatic smell of distant incense that he thought Egyptian, coming up now and then from below, as if from another, though a subterranean world. Possibly, thought he, for he had heard of them, the world of the mining gnomes, and I am breaking in upon their secrets, which is forbidden for men. The rustic, though courageous, was superstitious. But notwithstanding some fits of fear, the countryman went on, and at a much lower angle he met a wall in his face. But making a turn to the right with singular credit to his nerves, the explorer went down again, and now he saw at a vast distance, at the foot of a deeper staircase of stone, a steady though a pale light. This was shining up as if from a star, or coming from the center of the earth. Cheered by this light, though absolutely astounded, nay, frightened, at thus discovering light, whether natural or artificial, in the deep bowels of the earth, the man again descended, meeting a thin, humid trail of light as it looked, mounting up the center line of the shining, though mouldering old stairs, which apparently had not been pressed by a foot for many ages. He thought now, although it was probably only the wind in some hidden recess, or creeping down some gallery, that he heard a murmur overhead, as if of the uncertain rumble of horses and of heavy wagons or lumbering wains. Next moment all subsided into total stillness, but the distant light seemed to flicker, as if in recognition or answer to the strange sound. Half a dozen times he paused, and turned as if he would remount, almost flee for his life upward, as he thought, for this might be the secret haunt of robbers, or the dreadful abode of evil spirits. What if, in a few moments, he should come upon some scene to affright, or alight in the midst of desperate ruffians, or be caught by murderers? He listened eagerly. He now almost bitterly repented his descent. Still the light streamed at a distance, but still there was no sound to interpret the meaning of the light, or to display the character of this mysterious place, in which the countryman found himself entangled hopelessly, like a knight of romance in an enchanted world. The discoverer by this time stood still with fear, but at last summoning courage and recommending himself devoutly to God, he determined to complete his discovery. Above, he had been working in no strange place. The field he well knew. The woods were very familiar to him, and his own hamlet and his wife and family were only a few miles distant. He now hastily, and more in fear than through courage, noisily with his feet descended the remainder of the stairs, and the light grew brighter and brighter as he approached, until at last, at another turn, he came upon a square chamber, built up of large hewn ancient stones. He stopped, silent and awestruck. Here was a flagged pavement, and a somewhat lofty roof, gathering up into a center, in the groins of which was a rose carved exquisitely in some dark stone or marble. But what was this poor man's fright when, making another sudden turn, from between the jambs and from under the large archivolt of a Gothic stone portal, light streamed out over him with inexpressible brilliance, shining over everything and lighting up the place with brilliant radiance, like an intense golden sunset. He started back. Then his limbs shook and bent under him as he gazed with terror at the figure of a man, whose face was hidden, as he sat in a studious attitude in a stone chair, reading in a great book, with his elbow resting on a table like a rectangular altar, in the light of a large ancient iron lamp, suspended by a thick chain to the middle of the roof. A cry of alarm, which he could not suppress, escaped the scared discoverer, who involuntarily advanced one pace, beside himself with terror. He was now within the illuminated chamber. As his foot fell on the stone, the figure started bolted upright from his seated position, as if in awful astonishment. He erected his hooded head and showed himself as if in anger about to question the intruder. Doubtful if what he saw were a reality, or whether he was not in some terrific dream, the countryman advanced, without being aware of what he was doing, another audacious step. The hooded man now thrust out a long arm, as if in warning, and in a moment the discoverer perceived that his hand was armed with an iron baton, and that he pointed it as if tremendously to forbid further approach. Now, however, the poor man, not being in a condition either to reason nor to restrain himself with a cry, and in a passion of fear, took a third fatal step. And as his foot descended on the groaning stone, which seemed to give way for a moment under him, the dreadful man, or image, raised his arm high like a machine, and with his truncheon struck a prodigious blow upon the lamp, shattering it into 1,000 pieces, and leaving the place in utter darkness. This was the end of this terrifying adventure. There was total silence, far and near, only a long, low roll of thunder, or a noise similar to thunder, seemed to begin from a distance, and then to move with snatches as if making turns, and it then rumbled sullenly to sleep as through unknown, inaccessible passages. What these were, if any passages, nobody ever found out. It was only suspected that this hidden place referred in some way to the Rosicrucians, and that the mysterious people of that famous order had there concealed some of their scientific secrets. The place in Staffordshire became afterwards famed as the sepulchre of one of the brotherhood, whom, for want of a more distant recognition or name, the people chose to call Rosicrucians, in general reference to his order, and from the circumstances of the lamp, and its sudden extinguishment by the figure that started up. It was supposed that some Rosicrucian had determined to inform posterity that he had penetrated to the secret of the making of the ever-burning lamps of the ancients, though at the moment that he displayed his knowledge, he took effectual means that no one should reap any advantage from it. The Spectator, in number 379, from Thursday, May 16th, 1710, under the signature of CRUCIS, or X, which is understood to be that of Budgell, has the following account of that which is chosen there to be designated Rosicrucius sepulchre. Rosicrucius, says his disciples, made use of this method to show the world that he had reinvented the ever-burning lamps of the ancients, though he was resolved no one should reap any advantage from the discovery. We have chosen the above story as the introduction to our curious history. Christian Rosicrucian died in 1484. To account for Rosicrucianism not having been heard of until 1604, it has been asserted that this sudden first founder of Rosicrucianism bound his disciples not to reveal any of his doctrines until a period of 120 years after his death. The ancient Romans are said to have preserved lights in their sepulchres many ages by the oiliness of gold. Here steps in the art of the Rosicrucians. Resolved by hermetic methods into a liquid substance, and it is reported that at the dissolution of monasteries in the time of Henry VIII, there was a lamp found that had then burnt in a tomb for about 300 years after Christ, nearly 1,200 years. 2 of these subterranean lamps are to be seen in the Museum of Rarities at Leiden in Holland. One of these lamps in the papacy of Paul III was found in the tomb of Tulia, Cicero's daughter, which had been shut up for 1,550 years. From In Bailey, Translations of Colloquies of Erasmus, 1-271. Second edition. Notes: in the papacy of Paul III, in the Appian Way, where abundance of the chief heathens of old were laid, a sepulchre was opened, where was found the entire body of a fair virgin swimming in a wonderful juice, which kept it from putrefaction so well that the face seemed no way impaired, but lively and very beautiful. Her hair was yellow, tied up artificially, and kept together with a golden circlet or band. Under her feet burnt lamps, the light of which was extinguished at the opening of the sepulchre. But some inscriptions found about the tomb, it appeared that she must have lain there 1,500 years. Who she was never known, although many concluded her to be Tulliola, the daughter of Cicero. This discovery has been reported from various hands. Cedrenus makes mention of a lamp, which, together with an image of Christ, found at Edessa in the reign of Justinian the Emperor. It was set over a certain gate there, and elaborately enclosed and shut out from the air. This lamp, as appeared from the date attached to it, was lighted soon after Christ was crucified. It was found burning, as in fact it had done for 500 years, by the soldiers of Khosrus, king of Persia, by whom at the strange discovery and plunder the oil was taken out and cast into the fire. As it is reported, this wild act occasioned such a plague as brought death upon numbers of the forces of Khosrus, sufficiently punished for their sacrilegious mischief. At the demolition of our monasteries here in England, there was found in the monument, which was supposed to be that of Constantius Chlorus, father to the great Constantine, a burning lamp, which was thought to have continued burning there ever since his burial, which was about 300 years after Christ. The ancient Romans are said to have been able to maintain lights in their sepulchres for an indefinite time by an essence or oil obtained from liquid gold, which was an achievement assumed to have been only known to the Rosicrucians, who boasted this among some of their other stupendous arts. Baptista Porta, in his treatise on natural magic, relates that about the year 1550, in the Isle of Nisus, in the Bay of Naples, a marble sepulchre of a certain Roman was discovered, upon the opening of which a burning lamp, affording a powerful illumination, was discovered. The light of this lamp plied on the admission of the air, and it was speedily extinguished. It appeared from undoubted tokens in the mode of inscription that this wonderful lamp had been placed in its present receptacle before the advent of the Savior. Those who saw the lamp declared that the effulgence was of the most dazzling character, that the light did not flicker or change, but burnt marvelously steadily. A most celebrated lamp, called that of Pele, the son of Evander, who, as Virgil relates, was killed by Turnus, the account will be found in the 10th book of Virgil's Aeneid, is that reported as discovered not far from Rome, as far forward in time as the year 1401. It is related that a countryman was digging in the neighborhood, and that delving deeper than usual, he came upon a stone sepulchre, wherein there was discovered the body of a man of extraordinary size, as perfect and natural as if recently interred. Above the head of the deceased there was found a lamp, burning with the supposed fabulous perpetual fire. Neither wind or fire, nor any other superinduced means could extinguish it, but the flame was mastered eventually by the lamp being bored at bottom and broken by the astonished investigators of this consummate light. The man enclosed in this monument had a large wound in his breast. The man enclosed in the monument had a large wound in the beast, I believe it means breast, but it says beast, that this was the body of Pele was evident from the inscription on the tomb, which was as follows: Pele, Evander's son, whom Turnus' spear in battle slew, of mighty bulk, lies here. A very remarkable lamp was discovered about the year 1500 near Ateste, a town belonging to Padua in Italy, by a rustic who in his explorations in a field came upon an urn containing another urn, in which last was deposited one of these much doubted miraculous lamps. The element of this strange lamp appeared to be a very exquisite crystal liquor, by the ever-during power of which the lamp must have continued to shine for upwards of 1500 years, and unless this lamp had been so suddenly exposed to the action of the air, it is supposed that it might have continued to burn for a long time. This lamp, endowed with such unbelievable powers, was discovered to the workmanship of an unknown contriver named Maximus Olibius, who must have possessed the profoundest skill in chemical arts. On the greater urn some lines were inscribed in Latin, recording the perpetuation of this wonderful secret of the preparation and the starting of these almost immortal flames. St. Austin mentions a lamp that was found in a temple dedicated to Venus, which, notwithstanding that it was exposed to the open weather, could never be consumed or extinguished. Ludovicus Vives, his commentator, in a supplementary mention of ever-burning lamps, cites an instance of another similar lamp which was discovered a little before his time, and which was considered to have been burning for 1,050 years. It is supposed that the perpetuity of the flame of these wonderful lamps was owing to the consummate tenacity of the unctuous matter with which the light was maintained, in that the balance was so exquisitely perfect between the feeding material and the strength of the flame, in so proportion for everlasting provision and expenditure, that like the radical moisture and natural heat in animals, neither of them could ever unduly prevail. Lycitus, who has advanced this opinion, observes that in order to effectually prevent interference with this brilliance, the ancients hid these lamps in caverns or in enclosed monuments. Hence it happened that on opening these tombs and secret places, the admission of fresh air to the lamps destroyed the fine equilibrium and stopped the life, as it were, of the lamp, similarly as a blow or shock stops a watch in jarring the matchless mechanism. The symbol following this chapter is of a crescent moon, horn tips facing up, and a snowflake with 6 points. So a 6-pointed star, snowflake, upon a shaded and unshaded crescent moon, almost indicating an eclipse. Then there is what would traditionally be called an equilateral triangle, the mark of the triune preceding chapter the 3rd. It is a constant and very plausible charge offered by the general world against the possession of the power of gold-making as claimed by the alchemists, who were the practical branch of the Rosicrucians, that if such supposed power were in their hands, they would infallibly use it, and that quickly enough, for the acquisition of riches and power, say they, is the desire of all men, But this idea proceeds from an ignorance of the character and inclinations of real philosophers, and results from an inveterate prejudice relative to them. Before we judge of these, let us acquire a knowledge of the natural inclinations of very deeply learned men. Philosophers, when they have attained to much knowledge, which varies them of merely mundane matters, hold that the ordering of men, the following of them about by subservient people, and the continual glitter about them of the fine things of this world, are, after all, but of mean and melancholy accounts, because life is so brief, and this accidental preeminence is very transitory. Splendor, show, and bowing little delight the raised and abstract mind. That circuit of comfort formed by the owning of money and riches is circumscribed by the possessor's own ken. What is outside of this sight may just as well be enjoyed by any other person as by the owner, since all is the thinking of it. Only granting that a man has sufficient for his daily wants, letting the morrow indeed take thought for itself. One dinner a day, one bed for each night, in the alteration of sun and darkness, one of everything that is agreeable to or is desirable for man, is sufficient for any one man. A man's troubles are increased by the multiplication even of his enjoyments, because he is then beset with anxiety as to their repetition or maintenance, reduction of things to attend to, and not multiplication in his policy, because thinking of it is all that can affect him about anything in this world. By the time that the deep philosophical chemist has penetrated to the control and conversation of the ultimate elements, so as to have in his view the secret operations of nature, and to have caught nature, as it were, preparing her presentments and arranging her disguises behind the scenes, he is no more to be amused with vain book physics. After his spying into the subtle processes of nature, he cannot be contented with the ordinary toys of men. For are not worldly possessions, honor, rank, money, even wives, and numerous or any children, but toys in a certain sense? Where sink they in importance to him when the great unknown sets in which awaits every man? He who can work as nature works, causing the sunshine, so to speak, to light fire up independently in itself, and to breed and propagate precious things upon the atmosphere in which it burns, causing the growing supernatural soul to work amidst the seeds of gold, and to purge the material, devilish mass until the excrement is expelled, and it springs in health into condensating, solid splendor. A produce again to be sown, to fructify into fresh harvests. The alchemist, or prince of chemists, who can do this, laughs at the hordes of kings. By the time that the artist is thus so much more than man, is he the less desirous of the gratifying things to the ordinary man? Grandeur fades to him before such high intellectual grandeur. He is nearer to the angels, and the world has sunk infinitely below. He is the sky, and the bright shapes of the clouds of the sky, which he is going to convert, perhaps, into prisms, showering solid triumphs. He can well leave to common man his acres of mud, and the turbid pools spotted over them like the shining, showy disk of a snake. Man, under these enlightened philosophical circumstances, will only value the unseen kingdoms, glimpses of the immortal glories of which and of their Rosicrucian inhabitants he has obtained in his magic reveries. What can the longest ordinary man's life give to such a gifted thinker? Man's senses and their gratification, as long as the inlet and avenues of perception remain, world's magic so long as the strings cling tight to the air of imagination to play upon them, appetites which downward eyes to find their satisfaction, man's morality, with an exit into the shadows or into the grave while the sun is up. The longest life can be give him repetition to satiety of these things, repetition until he seems almost to tire of the common sun, of which he grows weary, as well as of his waste or extent of knowledge. To some minds, the world does not present such extraordinary attractions. The very possession of the heights of knowledge induces rather stay up there amidst the stars than descent. Every man almost has felt the sublime exaltation of a great height when he has achieved the top of a high hill and looks out and over the landscape for miles and miles. How very little the world looks under him. He is obliged to descend because he has his home under there, but he quits the upper regions with reluctance, although it is somewhat frightening, as though he were going to be flown away with it, to stay so high up. You become giddy by looking up at the stars, which then seem to be so much nearer as to be attainable. Limited as it is, life itself, very brief, very empty, very much disposed to repeat dull things, gathering up from about you in a strange sensation, sometimes in folds like a dream, or flowing on like a sleep-inducing river to the sea, carrying faces seen and snatched away, and obliterating voices which change into echoes. Life at its very best ought to be the stoicism of the spectator, who feels that he has come here somehow, though for what purpose he knows not, and he is rather amused as at a comedy in life, than engaged in it as in a business. Even perpetual youth and life prolonged, with pleasures infinite, even the fancied ever-during life, would to the deeply thinking man, who had risen, as it were, over life, into that strangely gifted being who has in himself the power of self-perpetuation, like the wandering Jew, seem vain. Man can be conceived as tiring of the sun, tiring of consciousness even. What an expression is that, forgotten by death, the only being through whom the scythe of the great destroyer passes scatheless. That life as a phantom, which is the only conceivable terrible doom of the wanderer, if such a magical being ever existed, whom as a locomotive symbol, to be perpetuated through the ages, the earth, at the command of the Savior, refused to hide, and of whom a legend, soon hushed in again, now and then rises to the popular whisper and to the popular distrust. We only adduce these remarks to show that, in the face of the spectator of the great ultimate mysterious man, children are no necessity, but an anxiety. Estates are a burden. Business is the oft-told purposeless tale to the wearying eye. He who can be the spectator of the ages has no particulars in ordinary life. He has nothing which can interest him. He can have no precise and consolidated likings or affections or admirations or even aversions, because the world is as a toy shop to him. Its small mechanism is an artificial show, of which, given the knowledge of the wills, he can predicate as to the movement safely, completely. To return for a moment to the idea of the wandering Jew, which some have supposed to be derived from the claim of the Rosicrucians to the possession of a secret means of renewing youth, and to the escape of some notion of it from out their writings. Even supposing that this strange tale was true, nothing can be imagined more melancholy than the state of this lone traveler, moving with his awful secret through the world, and seeing the successive generations, like leaves, perishing from about him. He counts the years like the traveler of a long summer day, to whom the evening will never come, though he sees his temporary companions at the different hours of the day depart appropriately and disappearing to their several homes by the wayside. To him the childhood of his companions seems to turn to old age in an hour. He remembers the far-off ancestors of his contemporaries. Fashions fleet, but your unsuspected youth is accommodated to all. Yours is, indeed, the persecution of the day life, which will not let you fall to sleep and cease to see the vanity of everything. Your friends of any period disappear. The assurance of the emptiness of all things is the stone as into which your heart is turned. Gray hairs and the old face have nothing with you, though you see them appearing upon all others. Familiar objects disappear from about you, and you and the sun seem the only things that survive as old friends. Indeed, it may be doubtful whether, to this supposed man of the ages, the generations would not seem to be produced as a purposeless efflux out of the ground by the sun. Like flowers or plants, so as mere matter of mold would all flesh appear, with a phenomenon only going with it in the article of the figure's uprightness as man, it having so strangely set its face against the stars, unlike the creatures doomed to move horizontally. We make these observations to show that, notwithstanding the opinions of the world to the contrary, there may have been men who have possessed these gifts, that is, the power of making gold and of perpetuating their lives, and yet that the exercise of these powers was forborne, and also that their secrets of production have most carefully been kept, lest wise men should, to speak in figure, have rushed in where they feared to tread, and have abused where the philosophers even would not use, despising wealth which they could not enjoy, and declining a perpetuated life, which would only add to their weariness. Life being only a repetition of the same suns, already found too unmeaning and too long, for it is a mistake to suppose that this life is so equally enjoyable by all. There is a sublime sorrow of the ages, as of the lone ocean. There is the languishment for the ever-lost original home in this tearful, mortal state. The philosophers knew that possession blunted desire, and that rich men may be poor men. A remarkable answer was made by a man who, to all appearance, possessed superabundantly the advantages of life, wealth, honor, wife, children, troops of friends, even health by day, but in his night he lived another life, for in it was presented another picture, and that unfailingly uncomfortable even to this good man, exchanging joy for horror. My friend, replied he to an inquirer, never congratulate a man upon his happiness until you become aware how he sleeps. Dreams are as that baleful country into which I pass every night of my life. And what can be said to a man who dreams constantly? And I believe it, and believes it. And what can be said to a man who dreams constantly, and believes it, that he is with the devil? There was no answering this, for every person leads two lives, altogether independent of each other, the days and the nights both full of life, though the night with the dreams may be of an opposite order. The world's circumstances may afford you solace and gratification, even happiness in the day, but you may be very miserable, notwithstanding, if it happens that you have persecution in your dreams. Here the world's advantages are of no use to you, for you are delivered over helpless, night after night, in your sleep, and you must have sleep, to the dominion of other powers, whom all your guards cannot keep out. For their inlet in quiet of another kind than the ordinary life's access. We advise you then to beware of this dark door. The other will perhaps take care of itself, letting in no ugly things upon you, but the former may let in unpleasant things upon you in full grasp, with your hands bound. End of chapter the 3rd. The symbol here is a binbin, an orb with feathers on either side in the shape of Egyptian hieroglyphs. This is the binbin. Chapter the 4th begins with the Hebrew shin. The Hermetic philosophers. Shin equals 300. There was among the sages a writer, Artephius, whose productions are very famous among the Hermetic philosophers, insomuch that the noble Olaus Borrochius, an excellent writer and a most candid critic, recommends these books to the attentive perusal of those who would acquire knowledge of this sublime highest philosophy. He is said to have invented a Kabbalistic magnet which possessed the extraordinary property of secretly attracting the aura, or mysterious spirit of human efflorescence, and prosperous bodily growth out of young men. In these benign and healthful springs of life he gathered up and applied by his magic art to himself, by inspiration, transudation, or otherwise, so that he concentrated in his own body, waning in age, the accumulated rejuvenance of many young people, the individual rejuvenance of many young people, the individual owners of which new fresh life suffered and were consumed in proportion to the extent in which he preyed vitally upon them. And some of them were exhausted by this enchanter and died. This was because their fresh young vitality had been unconsciously drawn out of them in his baneful devouring society, which was unsuspected because it afforded a glamorous delightful. Now this seems absurd, but it is not so absurd as we suppose when considered sympathetically. Sacred history affords considerable authority to this kind of opinion. We all are acquainted with the history of King David, to whom, when he grew old and stricken in years, Abishag the Shunammite was brought to recover him, a damsel described as very fair, and we are told that she lay in his bosom, and that thereby he gat heat, which means vital heat, but that the king knew her not. This latter clause in 1 Kings, 1st chapter, verse 4, all the larger critics, including those who speak in the commentaries of Munster, Grotius, Vossius, and others, interpret in the same way. The Seraglios of the Mohammedans have more of this less lustful meaning, probably, than is commonly supposed. The ancient physicians appear to have been thoroughly acquainted with the advantages of the companionship without irregular indulgence of the young to the old in the renewal of their vital powers. The elixir of life was also prepared by other and less criminal means than those singular ones hinted above. It was produced out of the secret chemical laboratories of nature by some adepts. The famous chemist Robert Boyle mentions a preparation in his works of which Dr. Lefebvre gave him an account in the presence of a famous physician and of another learned man. An intimate friend of the physician, as Boyle relates, had given, out of curiosity, a small quantity of this medicated wine or preparation to an old female domestic, and this being agreeable to the taste, had been partaken of for 10 or 12 days by the woman, who was near 70 years of age, but whom the doctor did not inform what the liquor was, nor what advantage he was expecting that it might effect. A great change did indeed occur with this old woman, for she acquired much greater activity, a sort of youthful bloom came to her countenance, her face was becoming much more smooth and agreeable, and beyond this, as a still more decided step backward to her youthful period, certain purgations came upon her again with sufficient severe indications to frighten her very much as to their meaning, so that the doctor, greatly surprised at his success, was compelled to forego his further experiments and to suppress all mention of this miraculous new cordial, for fear of alarming people with incomprehensible novelties, in regard to which they are very tenacious, having prejudices inveterate. But with respect to centenarians, some persons have been mentioned as having survived for hundreds of years, moving as occasion demanded from country to country, when the time arrived that, in the natural course of things, they should die, or be expected to die, merely changing their names and reappearing in another place as new persons, they having long survived all who knew them, and thus being safe from the risk of discovery. The Rosicrucians always most jealously guarded these secrets, speaking in enigmas and parables for the most part, and they adopted as their motto the advice of one of their number, one of the Gnostics of the early Christian period: learn to know all, but keep thyself unknown. Further, it is not generally known that the true Rosicrucians bound themselves to the obligations of comparative poverty but absolute chastity in the world, with certain dispensations and remissions that fully answered their purpose. For they were not necessarily solitary people. On the contrary, they were frequently gregarious and mixed freely with all classes, though privately admitting no law by their own. Their notions of poverty, or comparative poverty, were different from those that usually prevail. They felt that neither monarchs nor the wealth of monarchs could endow or aggrandize those who already esteemed themselves the superiors of all men, and therefore, though declining riches, they were voluntary in the renunciation of them. They held to chastity, because, entertaining some very peculiar notions about the real position and creation of the female sex, the enlightened or illuminated brothers held the monastic or celibate state to be infinitely more consonant with the intentions of Providence, since in everything possible to man's frail nature they sought to trample on the pollutions and the great degradation of this his state in flesh. They trusted the great lines of nature, not in the whole, but in part, as they believed nature was in certain senses not true and a betrayer, and that she was not wholly the benevolent power to endow, as accorded with the prevailing deceived notion. we wish not to discuss more particularly than thus the extremely refined and abstruse protesting views of these fanatic religionists who ignored nature. We have drawn to ourselves a certain frontier of reticence, up to which margin we may freely comment, and the limit is quite extended enough for the present popular purpose, though we absolutely refuse to overpass it with too distinct explanation, or to enlarge further on the strange persuasions of the Rosicrucians. There is related upon excellent authority to have happened an extraordinary incident at Venice, that made a very great stir among the talkers in the ancient place, and which will here supply at length, as due to so mysterious and amusing an episode. Every one who has visited Venice in these days, and still more those of the old-fashioned time, who have put their experience of it on record, are aware that freedom and ease among persons who make a good appearance prevail there, to an extent that, in this reserved and suspicious country, is difficult to realize. This doubt of respectability, until conviction disarms, has a certain constrained and unamiable effect on our English manners, though it occasionally secures us from imposition at the expense perhaps of our accessibility. A stranger who arrived in Venice one summer toward the end of the 17th century, and who took up his residence in one of the best sections of the city, by the considerable figure which he made, and through his own manners, which were polished, composed, and elegant, was admitted into the best company. This though he came with no introductions, nor did anybody exactly know who or what he was. His figure was exceedingly elegant and well proportioned, his face oval and long, his forehead ample and pale, and the intellectual faculties were surprisingly brought out, and in distinguished prominence. His hair was long, dark, and flowing, his smile inexpressibly fascinating, yet sad, and the deep light of his eyes seemed laden, to the attention sometimes of those noting him, with the sentiments and experience of all the historic periods. But his conversation, when he chose to converse, and his attainment and knowledge were marvelous, though he seemed always striving to keep himself back, and to avoid saying too much, yet not with an ostentatious reticence. He went by the name of Signor Quod, and was looked upon as a plain private gentleman of moderate independent estate. He was an interesting character, in short, one to make an observer speculate concerning him. This gentleman remained at Venice for some months, and was known by the name of the sober Signor among the common people on account of the regularity of his life. The common people on account of the regularity of his life. The composed simplicity of his manners, and the quietness of his costume, for he always wore dark clothes, and these of a plain, unpretending style. 3 things were remarked of him during his stay at Venice. The first was that he had a small collection of fine pictures, which he readily showed to everyone that desired it. The next, that he seemed perfectly versed in all arts and sciences, and spoke always with such minute correctness as to particulars as astonished, nay, silenced all who heard him, because he seemed to have been present at the occurrences which he related, making the most unexpected corrections in small facts sometimes. And it was, in the third place, observed that he never wrote or received any letter, never desired any credit, but always paid for everything in ready money, and made no use of bankers, bills of exchange, or letters of credit. However, he always seemed to have enough, and he lived respectably, though with no attempt at splendor or show. Signor Gualdi met shortly after his arrival at Venice one day at the coffee house which he was in the habit of frequenting, a Venetian nobleman of sociable manners, who was very fond of art, and this pair used to engage in sundry discussions, and they had many conversations concerning the various objects and pursuits which were interesting to both of them. Acquaintance ripened into friendly esteem, and the nobleman invited Signor Gualdi to his private house, whereat, for he was a widower, Signor Gualdi first met the nobleman's daughter, a very beautiful young maiden of 18, of much grace and intelligence, and of great accomplishments. The nobleman's daughter was just introduced at her father's house from a convent, or pension, while she had been educated by the nuns. This young lady, in short, from constantly being in his society and listening to his interesting narratives, gradually fell in love with the mysterious stranger, much for the reasons of Desdemona, though Signor Gualdi was no swarthy Moor, but only a well-educated gentleman, a thinker rather than the desirer to be a doer. At times, indeed, his countenance seemed to grow splendid and magical in expression, and he boasted certainly wondrous discourse, and a strange and weird fascination would grow up about him, as it were, when he became more than usually pleased, communicative, and animated. Altogether, when you were set thinking about him, he seemed a puzzling person, and of rare gifts, though when mixing only with the crowd you would scarcely distinguish him from the crowd, nor would you observe him, unless there was something romantically akin to him in you, excited by his talk. And now for a few remarks on the imputed character of these Rosicrucians, and in regard to them, however their existence is disbelieved, the matters of fact we meet with sprinkled, but very sparingly, in the history of these hermetic people, are so astonishing, and at the same time are preferred with such confidence, that if we disbelieve, which it is impossible to avoid, and that from the preposterous and unearthly nature of their pretensions we cannot escape the conviction that, if there is not foundation for it, their imprudence and egotism is most audacious. They speak of all mankind as infinitely beneath them. Their pride is beyond idea, although they are most humble and quiet in exterior. They glory in poverty, and declare that if the world ordered for them, and this though they boast universal riches. They decline all human affections, or submit to them as advisable, escapes only, appearance of loving obligations which are assumed for convenient acceptance, or for passing in a world which is composed of them, or of their supposal. They mingle most gracefully in the society of women, with hearts wholly incapable of softness in this direction, while they criticize them with pity or contempt in their own minds as altogether another order of beings from men. They are most simple and deferential in their exterior, and yet the self-value which fills their hearts ceases its self-glorying expansion only with the boundless skies. Up to a certain point, they are the sincerest people in the world. But rock is soft to their impenetrability afterwards. In comparison with the hermetic adepts, monarchs are poor, and their greatest accumulations are contemptible. But the side of the sages, by the side of the sages, the most learned are mere dolts and blockheads. They make no movement toward fame because they abnegate and disdain it. If they become famous, it is in spite of themselves. They seek no honors because there can be no gratification in honors to such people. Their greatest wish is to steal unnoticed and unchallenged through the world, and to amuse themselves with the world because they are in it, and because they find it about them. Thus, toward mankind they are negative, towards everything else positive, self-contained, self-illuminated, self-everything, but always prepared, nay, enjoined to do good, wherever possible are safe. To this immeasurable exaltation of themselves, what standard of measure or what appreciation can you apply? Ordinary estimates fail in the idea of it. Either the state of these occult philosophers is the height of sublimity, or it is the height of absurdity. Either the state of these occult philosophers is the height of sublimity, or it is the height of absurdity. Not being competent to understand them are their claims. The world insists that these are futile. The result entirely depends upon their being fact or fancy in the ideas of the Hermetic philosophers. The puzzling part of the investigation is that the treatises of these profound writers abound in the most acute discourse upon different subjects, and contain splendid passages and truths upon all subjects, upon the nature of metals, upon medical science, upon the unsupposed properties of simples, upon theological and ontological speculation, and upon science and objects of thought generally. Upon all these matters they enlarge the reader stupendously when the proper attention is directed them. End of chapter the 4th. The symbol here is the mythical Tower of Babel. It is a cylinder similar to a water tank or an oil tank, wrapped around with a cord, very likely made of concrete, and the cord itself made of a metal, a braided metal or Damascan steel, set upon the ground itself, a silo in the traditional sense that might hold grain. As possibly did the Tower of Babel.